10 plants every senior should grow to protect their eyesight after 60. Most people think eyesight just fades with age. A little blur here, a little haze there, glasses that get thicker every few years. It's treated as a fact of life, like graying hair. But the timeline isn't as fixed as it looks. Some of what people call normal aging eyes is actually a nutrition story, a quiet, slow-moving one. And once you understand what your eyes are chemically built from, a certain kind of garden starts to look less like a hobby and more like a maintenance plan. This is where the real explanation begins. What people believe. Ask most people over 60 what protects their eyes, and you'll hear the same three answers. Sunglasses, regular eye exams, maybe carrots, because someone's grandmother said so decades ago. All three are reasonable. None of them is the full picture. Eye exams catch problems, they don't prevent them. Sunglasses block UV light, which matters, but UV exposure is only one contributor to long-term eye aging. And the carrot advice, while not wrong, is incomplete. It points at vitamin A and misses the two compounds that matter most for the specific part of the eye most people lose function in first, the macula. Here's the surface-level understanding most people carry around. Vision loss declines with age. Some people get lucky genetically, some don't. And there's not much to be done besides checkups and sunglasses. It's not an unreasonable belief, it's just missing a layer. There's also a quieter assumption underneath all of this, that vision loss is mostly a matter of chance. That some people simply have good eyes and others don't, the way some people are naturally tall and others aren't. Genetics do play a real role in conditions like macular degeneration and cataracts, but treating eyesight as purely a genetic lottery skips over the parts of the equation that are actually adjustable, and it's worth separating those two things clearly before going further. What's actually happening? The part of your eye responsible for sharp central vision, reading, recognizing faces, seeing fine detail, is called the macula. Inside the macula is a small, dense deposit of pigment made from two carotenoids, lutein and zeaxanthin. Your body cannot produce either one. They come exclusively from food. This pigment does two jobs. It filters high-energy blue light before it reaches the light-sensitive cells behind it, and it acts as a localized antioxidant, neutralizing the oxidative stress that light exposure generates in that tissue over decades of use. Researchers refer to this as macular pigment optical density, and it's measurable. You can actually test how much of it someone has. The National Eye Institute, part of the U.S. National Institutes of Health, ran a large multi-year clinical trial on this exact question. It's called AREDS-2, the Age-Related Eye Disease Study 2, and it followed thousands of participants over 5 years. The findings, published in the early 2010s, showed that a formulation containing lutein and zeaxanthin, along with vitamin C, vitamin E, zinc, and copper, was associated with a measurably slower progression of age-related macular degeneration in people who already had intermediate-stage disease. It's one of the better-supported nutritional findings in ophthalmology, not a fringe claim. That's the part most people never hear about carrots and eyesight. Vitamin A supports the retina broadly and matters for night vision, but lutein and zeaxanthin are the compounds doing the specific, targeted work inside the macula. And they're not found in orange vegetables. They're found almost entirely in dark leafy greens, along with a handful of yellow and orange plants that concentrate them differently than beta-carotene does. This is the part most people miss. It also helps to understand why blue light exposure matters in the first place, because that part rarely gets explained either. Blue light sits at the high-energy end of the visible spectrum. It scatters more than other wavelengths and penetrates deeper into eye tissue, which means the macula absorbs a disproportionate share of it over a lifetime of exposure to daylight, screens, and artificial lighting. Lutein and zeaxanthin sit directly in front of the light-sensitive photoreceptor cells and act like a built-in filter, absorbing a portion of that energy before it reaches tissue that can't easily repair itself. Without enough of that pigment in place, more of that energy reaches the retina unfiltered year after year. None of this means blue light exposure is dangerous in any dramatic sense. It's a normal part of being outdoors and living in a modern, screen-lit world. The relevant question isn't exposure, which is largely unavoidable, but buffer. And the buffer is built entirely from food. Why this changed? If lutein and zeaxanthin are this important, why isn't it common knowledge the way vitamin C or calcium is? Part of the answer is generational diet shift. Before the mid-20th century, home gardens and small farms supplied a much higher proportion of daily vegetables, and dark leafy greens, kale, chard, collards, mustard greens, were staples in a way they aren't now. As food systems industrialized and shifted toward shelf-stable, transportable, visually appealing produce, leafy greens became a smaller share of the average plate. They bruise easily, they wilt fast, and they don't ship or store as well as a potato or a carrot. Convenience and shelf life reshaped what showed up in the produce aisle, and leafy greens lost ground to more durable crops. There's also a simpler reason. Lutein and zeaxanthin research is relatively recent as a mainstream nutritional focus. Vitamin deficiency diseases like scurvy and rickets were identified and addressed generations ago, so vitamin C and vitamin D became household names. Macular pigment research largely developed from the 1980s onward, and the major clinical trial evidence didn't arrive until the 2000s and 2010s. It's not an old settled fact like oranges have vitamin C. It's a newer finding that simply hasn't filtered into everyday food culture yet. Put those two things together, a diet that quietly moved away from the foods that supply these compounds, and a body of research that's still working its way into public awareness, and you get a nutrient gap that most people don't even know they have. This isn't really about a single disease. It's about the slow erosion of visual sharpness that a lot of people write off as inevitable. Age-related macular degeneration is the leading cause of vision loss in adults over 50 in the United States, according to the CDC. Cataracts affect the majority of Americans by their 80s. Neither condition has one single cause. Genetics, UV exposure, smoking history, and blood sugar control all play a role, but nutrition is one of the few factors a person can actually influence day to day at almost no cost for the rest of their life. The subtle part is this. Macular pigment doesn't disappear overnight. It's built and maintained gradually over months and years of dietary intake. So the effect of low intake isn't a dramatic event. It's a slightly reduced buffer against blue light and oxidative stress, compounding quietly for decades. By the time it shows up as blurred central vision or difficulty reading in low light, it's been building for a long time. That's the part that deserves attention. Not fear, just an accurate picture of what's actually accumulating or not accumulating with every plate of food. There's a practical reason this matters more after 60 specifically. Macular pigment density tends to plateau based on long-term dietary patterns, and the eye conditions most associated with aging, macular degeneration, cataracts, and general contrast sensitivity loss, tend to become clinically noticeable in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, even though the underlying oxidative changes have often been building since middle age. That gap between cause and noticeable effect is exactly why this tends to fly under the radar. Nobody feels their macular pigment declining in their 40s. They notice it when reading a restaurant menu in dim lighting becomes difficult in their late 60s, and by then it can feel like it appeared out of nowhere. It didn't. It built slowly, the same way it can be rebuilt slowly. And this connects to something deeper than diet alone. It reflects how the body communicates slow, cumulative problems compared to acute ones. A burn or a cut announces itself immediately. Decades of marginal nutrient intake doesn't announce itself at all. It just quietly narrows the margin a person has before things start to show. That's a pattern worth remembering well beyond eyesight specifically. The practical shift. None of this requires a supplement aisle or a prescription. It requires a garden bed, a few containers, or even a couple of pots on a balcony, and a repeated habit over years, not weeks. What follows are 10 plants that are unusually easy for an older gardener to grow at home, and that happen to be among the richest natural sources of lutein, zeaxanthin, vitamin A, vitamin C, or the other nutrients tied to long-term eye health. This isn't a list of rare superfoods. It's mostly the plants a home garden used to be built around before the produce aisle reorganized everyone's habits. A brief but important note: none of these plants replace medical care. Anyone noticing changes in their vision or managing a diagnosed eye condition should still be seeing an eye doctor regularly. This is about lowering long-term risk through diet, not treating an existing condition on your own. It's also worth being honest about the limits of what diet alone can do. Nutrition is one input among several. Genetics, blood sugar control, smoking history, and UV exposure all matter too. And the research on lutein and zeaxanthin points to reduced progression risk in the studies that have looked at it, not a guarantee of any individual outcome. This isn't a claim that eating kale prevents macular degeneration outright. It's a claim that the raw material for a measurable protective mechanism in the eye comes from food, and most modern diets supply less of that raw material than they used to. Kale, the densest lutein source in the average garden. Kale consistently tests as one of the highest lutein and zeaxanthin sources of any commonly grown vegetable, ahead of spinach by some measurements. It's also remarkably forgiving to grow. Kale tolerates light frost, actually improving in flavor after a cold snap, and it can be grown in a container as small as 12 inches deep with consistent watering and 6 hours of sunlight. A single plant can be harvested continuously for months. You take the outer leaves and let the center keep producing, so it never needs replanting mid-season. For someone with limited mobility, a single kale plant in a large pot near the back door can supply a steady, low-effort harvest for most of the year. Spinach, fast, cool season, and nutrient-dense. Spinach is one of the fastest-growing leafy greens available, often ready for a first harvest within 4 to 6 weeks of sowing. It's rich in lutein and zeaxanthin, along with vitamin C and folate. It prefers cooler weather and tends to bolt or go to seed and turn bitter once summer heat sets in, so it's best grown in early spring and again in fall, 2 harvest windows rather than one long season. A shallow, wide container works well, since spinach has a relatively shallow root system, making it one of the easier crops to manage from a seated position or raised bed. Collard greens, heat-tolerant and long-lasting. Where spinach struggles in summer heat, collard greens do the opposite. They hold up well through hot weather and keep producing long after more delicate greens have given out. Collards are a strong source of lutein and zeaxanthin, along with calcium and vitamin K. Southern U.S. gardening traditions have relied on them for generations, largely because a few plants can supply a household with greens across most of the growing season. They're also unusually resistant to common garden pests compared to other brassicas, which makes them a low-maintenance choice for a gardener who doesn't want to spend time managing insect damage. Swiss chard, colorful, cut and come again, and mineral-rich. Swiss chard offers the same cut-and-come-again style of harvesting as kale, plus a visual bonus. Many varieties have bright red, yellow, or pink stems that make the plant genuinely attractive in a garden bed or large container. Nutritionally, it delivers meaningful lutein and zeaxanthin, along with magnesium and potassium. It tolerates both heat and mild cold better than spinach, giving it one of the longest harvest windows of any leafy green on this list, often from spring through the first hard frost of the year. Carrots, the classic for a specific reason. Carrots earn their reputation just not for the reason most people assume. They're not a major lutein source, but they're one of the richest dietary sources of beta-carotene, which the body converts into vitamin A. Vitamin A is essential for the light-sensitive cells in the retina and specifically supports night vision. Different mechanism, different part of the eye, but genuinely important. Carrots grow well in raised beds or deep containers with loose, stone-free soil, and they're one of the more satisfying crops for a gardener to harvest since the payoff is literally underground and hidden until pulled. Sweet potatoes, vitamin A from an unexpected angle. Sweet potatoes, particularly the orange-fleshed varieties, are another strong beta-carotene source, and the vines themselves produce edible leafy greens that are eaten in many parts of the world but rarely in typical American gardens, a genuinely underused part of the plant. Sweet potatoes need a longer growing season, generally 90 to 120 days, and enough space for vines to spread, but they require very little maintenance once established, tolerating dry spells better than most root vegetables. Bell peppers, orange and yellow. Vitamin C supports the blood vessels within the eye and works alongside vitamin E as part of the antioxidant combination studied in the AREDS trial. Orange and yellow bell peppers are especially high in vitamin C, in some comparisons higher gram for gram than citrus. They grow well in large containers with consistent watering and full sun, and a single healthy plant can produce a steady supply of peppers over an entire summer. They're slower to establish, generally needing 60 to 90 days to first harvest, but they keep producing for months once they start. Corn, an unlikely but legitimate source. Corn doesn't usually come up in conversations about eye health, but sweet corn contains meaningful amounts of both lutein and zeaxanthin concentrated in the kernel itself. It's a space-intensive crop. Corn is wind-pollinated and needs to be planted in blocks rather than single rows to pollinate properly, so it suits a larger garden bed than a container. For a gardener with the space for it, a modest block of corn adds a source of these two specific compounds that most people wouldn't otherwise think to plant. Blueberries, a longer-term investment with strong antioxidant support. Blueberries aren't a lutein source, but they're rich in anthocyanins, a different class of antioxidant compound that's been studied for supporting blood flow to the retina and reducing oxidative stress in issue tissue more broadly. Unlike the annual vegetables on this list, blueberries are a perennial shrub, a one-time planting that with the right acidic soil can produce fruit for well over a decade. They're slower to establish, often taking 2 to 3 years before a meaningful harvest, but for a gardener thinking in years rather than seasons, they're one of the lowest maintenance long-term additions to a garden. 10. Marigold, grown for the flower, valued for the pigment. This is the one entry on the list that surprises people. Tagetes erecta, the common garden marigold, is actually the primary commercial source of lutein used in dietary supplements and in poultry feed to deepen egg yolk color. Most bottled lutein supplements on pharmacy shelves originated as marigold petal extract. The petals themselves are edible and have a mild, slightly bitter saffron-like flavor and can be dried and steeped or added to salads in small amounts. Marigolds are about as easy to grow as a plant gets. Full sun, minimal water, blooming from early summer through the first frost, and they double as a natural pest deterrent for surrounding vegetables, which is why many gardeners already grow them without realizing what's actually in the petals. For a lot of longtime gardeners, this is the plant on the list that reframes something they've already been growing for years, for entirely different reasons, without ever connecting it to the compound sitting in their medicine cabinet supplement bottle. The bigger pattern. None of these 10 plants is exotic. Every one of them would have been recognizable to a home gardener a century ago. What's changed isn't the plants, it's how central they are to the average diet and how much awareness there is about which specific compounds inside them are doing specific, measurable work in a specific part of the eye. This isn't just a story about eyesight. It's a smaller example of a pattern that shows up across food and health more broadly. A nutrient or a food group quietly loses ground to convenience and shelf life. The research supporting its importance develops decades later, and by the time the two connect, most people have already built a lifetime of habits around the gap. Eyesight happens to be one of the more measurable, well-studied versions of that pattern, thanks to research like AIRS 2, but it's rarely the only one operating in someone's diet at the same time. What makes this particular pattern worth paying attention to is how reversible it is, at least partially, at almost any age. Macular pigment density has been shown in research to respond to increased dietary intake within months, not years. It's not a window that closes. A gardener starting these 10 plants at 65 isn't starting too late, they're simply starting. Where this goes next. This is not the first time a shift like this has happened, and it won't be the last. The same basic pattern, a nutrient quietly deprioritized by modern food systems, then rediscovered decades later through research, shows up again and again once you start looking for it in other parts of the diet. Eyesight simply happens to be one of the clearer, better documented examples. What happens next, for anyone reading this, comes down to something almost absurdly small, whether a few of these plants end up in a pot on a porch or a bed in the backyard, watered consistently for a few years. That's really the whole intervention. No dramatic change, no elimination diet, just a slow rebuilding of something the modern plate quietly stopped supplying as generously as it once did. And once you start noticing this particular pattern, convenience quietly replacing something nutritionally specific, followed by research catching up years later, it gets harder to look at other parts of a typical diet the same way again. Vitamin D and sun exposure, omega-3s and fish, fiber and whole grains. Each one follows a version of the same arc at a different stage of public awareness. Eyesight simply happens to be one of the clearer, better documented examples. That's usually how the most useful information works. Not hidden exactly, just slower to spread than the habits it's quietly competing against.